The Battle of Midway was a dramatic turning point in the Pacific War, but these high-stakes situations lend themselves to embellishment and simplification. Wartime secrecy, propaganda, and post-war hero worship have, over time, blurred the facts. Hollywood has often overdramatized or romanticized Midway, while a dearth of Japanese sources has contributed to myth-making and long-lasting misconceptions. Here are 5 myths that persist to this day. Following the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942, Yorktown sustained significant damage, particularly to her flight deck, boiler propulsion systems, and hull plating. As she limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, engineers estimated she would require 3 months of repairs and dry dock on the West Coast. Yet within 3 days, she was off to Midway. So the myth of completing 90 days worth of repairs in 3 days was born. Statements like this from a reputable historian who should have known better perpetuate the myth.
Yorktown limped back from the Coral Sea, and she went into dry dock there in Pearl Harbor. And the dock masters told Admiral Nimitz, "Admiral, it's going to take us 3 months to make this ship ready." And Nimitz said, "Gentlemen, I need this ship in 3 days." And they turned to and made her ready in 3 days. And
was it therefore a superhuman effort to cram 90 days worth of work into 3 days? The flight deck was the easiest of the 3 areas of concern to fix. Because the deck was made of wood, Yorktown's crew had already completed the majority of the work by the time she arrived in Pearl. The gears that controlled the central lift were damaged and could only be partially repaired. It worked, but with lower reliability and slower operation. The propulsion system, however, was of far greater concern. A bomb detonation above a boiler room had disabled 3 of her 9 boilers. Since fixing them would take specialized parts and a lot more time than they had, they were left inoperable. Sources vary, but with only 2/3 of her normal power output, she could achieve a speed of 17 to 20 knots instead of her normal flank speed of 32. Because she couldn't keep up with the other 2 carriers, she would be assigned her own task force. This lack of power would have a direct bearing on the upcoming battle. One of the primary defenses against torpedo attacks is speed and maneuverability. So the question remains, could she have avoided the 2 torpedoes that hit her if she had full power? The biggest concern was her structural integrity. Near misses by 8 bombs had opened large seams in her hull and ruptured fuel lines. With so little time available, instead of individually fixing the hull's ruptured seams, an enormous steel plate was welded over the damaged section. The metallurgical composition of the plating was ill-suited for lap welding. This hastily performed shortcut created fragile connections and put the ship at risk. The chief engineer informed Nimitz that as long as she was kept out of storms, the welding was good enough for 2 or 3 weeks of operations, but she had to return to dry dock within that time frame. Nimitz stated that despite her flaws, as long as she can effectively operate her air wing, he must have her for the upcoming operation. As a result, there were no engineering miracles. In the real world, 3 days is only long enough to complete 3 days worth of work. Although I saw this one on TikTok, it has been replicated in many other publications.
The Japanese plan was complex and overly ambitious, involving a diversionary attack in the Aleutians.
The invasion of the Aleutian Islands was a decoy operation. This is easily disproven by a single fact. The Battle of Midway took place on June 4th, followed by the Japanese occupation of the Aleutian Islands 2 days later. What is the point of setting up a decoy 2 days after the event has already occurred? The IJN wanted the U.S. Navy to come and fight them so they could destroy their carriers, not flee in the opposite direction. In reality, the Japanese Navy needed Army support to successfully invade Midway. To obtain this support, the Army requested that the Navy provide ships and air support for its operations in the Aleutian Islands. Admiral Yamamoto diverted 2 carriers, Junyo and Ryujo, from the Midway operation to support the Army's successful invasion of Kiska and Attu in the Aleutian Islands. Would the outcome have changed if these 2 carriers had been available for the Midway operation? This is a clip from a recent Hollywood movie about the Battle of Midway.
We have 3 carriers. The Japs have 10. We have 0 functional battleships. They have 9. They have more cruisers, more bombers, more fighters.
It's no surprise that the myth that the U.S. was vastly outnumbered and triumphed despite all the odds has been sustained when false claims like these are made. A cursory glance at the order of battle would appear to support this conclusion. Japan not only had more fleet carriers, but also 7 battleships, while the U.S. had none, and 5 more cruisers than the U.S. had available. This, however, is misleading. Rather than a naval conflict, the Battle of Midway was primarily an aerial battle. None of the ships actually fired at each other. It is said that whoever controls the air controls the sea beneath it. Despite having 1 fewer fleet carrier, the United States still had the unsinkable Midway Island. The United States dispatched as many planes as feasible to fill the Midway airfield with 122 aircraft. When combined with the 233 carrier-based aircraft, they had more than 100 aircraft superiority. When the element of surprise is taken into account, the Japanese were at a significant disadvantage. The only contribution made by non-carrier ships was to provide anti-aircraft fire protection for the carriers, so only the ships attached to the carrier strike force had any influence on the battle. This effectively excluded the vast majority of Japanese ships from having any impact on the battle. Therefore, the IJN did not engage in naval combat after losing the air battle. Instead, they just returned to base. The myth that Japanese carriers had their flight decks crammed full of strike aircraft about to take off when the dauntless dive bomber struck is based on U.S. pilots seeing some aircraft on deck and testimony from one Japanese survivor. However, the evidence seems to contradict this assumption. The carrier Hiryu was not affected by the dive bomber strike that disabled the other 3 carriers. However, her first strike against the Yorktown was launched 34 minutes after the attack ended. It would have taken far less time to launch this strike if they had been on deck ready to take off. Surviving radio transmission and flight logs support the assumption that it would have taken at least half an hour before the Japanese could launch their strike. Finally, if the aircraft had been on deck rather than in the hangars, the inferno would not have been as severe, with fueled aircraft engulfed in flames and secondary explosions caused by bombs cooking off from inside the hangar. It appears that what the U.S. dive bomber pilots saw on the Japanese carrier flight decks were Zero fighters that had landed for rearming and fueling after fighting off a constant stream of torpedo bombers for the previous hour. The way the battle unfolded has given rise to the myth that the Japanese were taken by complete surprise with the discovery of the U.S. carriers and had no plan on how to deal with the situation. In reality, the Japanese had extensive contingency plans in place specifically for this outcome. Although they did not expect to encounter U.S. carriers so early in the battle, they kept half of their strike force ready and armed with anti-shipping ordnance so that they could respond quickly if the situation that actually unfolded occurred. So what exactly went wrong? In a single word, Nagumo. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo led the carrier strike force, but was not Admiral Yamamoto's first choice for command due to his lack of naval aviation experience. Yamamoto was overruled by his superiors because Nagumo had seniority and was therefore next in line for the position. Yamamoto believed Jisaburo Ozawa was the best candidate for command, and future events proved him correct. At the Battle of the Marianas Turkey Shoot, he completely outmaneuvered Kincaid, allowing him to strike without being hit in return. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Ozawa duped Halsey into leaving the invasion fleet vulnerable to attack by Kurita's battleship strike force. Had he been in command at Midway, it is doubtful that he would have made the mistakes Nagumo did. When it became clear that another strike was required to neutralize Midway, Nagumo, in direct violation of Yamamoto's order to keep a reserve strike force armed for anti-ship operations, had them rearmed with high-explosive bombs. When a sighting report of a U.S. fleet arrived, he compounded his error by ordering the time-consuming process of switching back to armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes. This would have been necessary if he had been up against battleships or British carriers with armored flight decks, but against U.S. carriers with wooden flight decks, high-explosive bombs would have rendered them inoperable if struck. When the U.S. dive bombers appeared above the carrier strike force, Nagumo's carriers had their hangars packed with fueled aircraft loaded with bombs. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Subscribe and don't forget to hit that bell icon so you don't miss the next video.